I'm Liam Kelly from the Institute of Asian Studies, Universiti Brunei Darussalam, and I'm talking today with Senior Professor Phan Lê Hà from SHBIE, the Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah Institute of Education at Universiti Brunei Darussalam. Professor Phan just gave a Wednesday seminar to IAS a few days ago, and we're going to talk about your seminar talk as well as your research.
Yes.
Okay, so you just gave a talk a couple days ago entitled Higher Education, English, and the Idea of the West, Globalizing and Encountering a Global South Regional University. So that's a lot of big words, global, South, West, English, higher education, regional university. Perhaps you could tell us, maybe what it is exactly that you're looking at, and then we'll unpack this and go deeper into it.
Okay, so actually my seminar was just a case study of my longitudinal research project looking at transnational education in Asia and the Gulf region. And of course I look at English medium education or programs across these two regions. And basically, in the seminar, I look at a case study of a regional university in Vietnam who set its own terms for the internationalization of higher education by reaching out to ASEAN countries, in particular the Philippines, to go global. And yes.
Whoa, so I think usually when we think of the internationalization of higher education, or the globalization of higher education, that usually is equated with the West. Yes. How does this fit into that?
Yeah, so I said, for a long time, probably since the 1990s or so, the internationalization of higher education has been primarily involved Western countries, particularly those like English-speaking countries in the West, going global through their means of English medium programs and curricula. So that is a kind of very conventional forms of internationalization. Right. But in my research, I look at new players in so-called in the global South or in Asia, Africa, and the Gulf region who, together with reaching to the West, also reaching among themselves and create their own terms and practices of internationalization.
Okay, so if that's the case, can we see this as a kind of counter to the West, that they're creating a new space for a non-Western curriculum, or?
No, actually, as much as I wanted to see it that way, it's not about them creating their non-Western curricula, right, or program. It has a lot to do with bringing all those elements together. In one way, they are still inspired by a lot of existing curricula from, let's say, from the US, from Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, but they are cultivating new partnerships, new interactions, and also targeting new groups of students who are normally not considered so-called traditional participants of international education. Yes, so in a way, I tried to show that how the internationalization of higher education, on the one hand, could be seen as being unequal to certain groups of participants, but on the other hand, enable unexpected space for those who normally can't afford international education.
Okay, now when you get to afford, I mean, one of the critiques of the internationalization of education has been that it's basically just an economic enterprise. So you've got these universities, say, who set up campuses overseas where maybe the quality doesn't meet, say, the same level as it does in the home country, but they're bringing in money, and it's a kind of a feeder for universities. If that's a critique that's been lodged at established universities who are engaged in the internationalization of education, what are the critiques or what are the issues facing a regional university in Vietnam that's trying to engage in this world of internationalization of education?
Yes, I think that's a great question. Of course, we have seen competing practices, competing conceptualization of internationalization of higher ed. Of course, the economic drive is one, obviously a dominant practice, but it's not everything about the internationalization of higher ed. So in my case, I tried to show a really interesting but also often ignored aspect of that, which is, how the seemingly kind of average, you could say educational space created by some players in international education have the power to transform individuals who participate in the process.
Okay, can you give an example of that?
All right. Okay. So for example, in the case study that I presented during my seminar, I look at how a Vietnamese regional universities has identified the Philippines as well as academics and students from the Philippines as those who could help that university in Vietnam to leverage its international image by highlighting the role of English possessed by many Filipinas, like academics and students in the Philippines, and also from an understanding that the Philippines for a long time has been enjoying an international status associated with English. And it is not a coincidence that for the past decades or so, there have been thousands of students from Japan and Korea studying English in the Philippines. And also Manila, for example, has been considered a hub of international education in the whole region. And yes, there has been scholarship written about that.
Wait a second. So you're saying that the Philippines is seen as sort of a place is famous for its English.
Yeah.
But, I think, haven't you also seen around Asia the implementation of policies that say that if you want to teach English in our country, you have to come from a country where English is the native language, and Philippines is not considered one of them. So Filipino teachers have had to go back home.
Yes.
So how can we balance those two views?
Right. So in my research, more broadly, I've been looking at different questions as well as problems associated with stereotype, attached to a particular group of speakers of English. So it is quite well known in my field, like critical applied linguistics, that certain speakers of English coming from certain countries are considered like lower tier or whatever, or second class, users of English. But scholarship in my field has continuously proved that no, actually, speakers of English or users of English have had the power to own and appropriate English. So English these days no longer belongs to so-called native speakers of English. And the concept of native speakers of English have been so problematic and have been contested. And so I think that in my seminar, I did unpack some of the complexity associated with that concept. So in the context of the Philippines and Philippine English, of course, in my field, there's been a lot of writing about that. And so when you, like Vietnam, in relation to the Philippines, it's quite, actually, a lot of Vietnamese speakers of English still look at the Philippines as a good example of good, how could I say, good model for the English language, implementation at different levels of schooling. And
so, but I'm still, just to take this step a little further, sure, a lot of people have, I'm sure that a lot of academics have, examined the ownership of English and have argued that, of course you don't have to be from, say, the US or the UK but, parents who send their kids off to schools have different ideas. And what are people thinking about a regional university in Vietnam that employs, say, teachers from the Philippines or from other countries? How is that received, or how does the university use that as its selling point?
Okay, so the specific case studies that I presented, that the institution in that case study didn't target so-called students who normally would go to other programs, let's say provided by a counterpart, from Australia or the US, things like that.
But how about the students who were there? Did you, engage with them to find out how they thought about this?
Right. Okay. So actually, we all know that. Oh, sorry, I wouldn't say we all know that, but at least, we kind of know. So the so-called native speaker or programs coming from the US, things like that, I think a lot of them are symbolic rather than real. And so initially a lot of students, maybe parents or academics, might be attracted to that symbolic idea, right? Or an imagined idea of what is good, right? But as they participate in an actual program, and communicating with an actual person coming from a particular place, then the ideas about, okay, a native speaker or whose English is better change. And that is what I show in my case studies. So when I had the chance to meet and talk with a group of, with many students, from Laos, Indonesia, the Philippines, for example, who had gone through that international education space in that regional university in Vietnam, and through their sharing and exchange of communication with me for a few years, I could see that what they had been able to do is to cultivate an identity for themselves that they never thought of before going to Vietnam. So what attracted them to Vietnam was, initially, probably had nothing to do with Vietnam, because all of them basically confessed that they didn't go to Vietnam because Vietnam considered being a great country for international education, or because of its English medium programs, but they got attracted to that particular university in Vietnam because of the fact that that university had some programs, adapted from an existing curriculum from a US university. So the US connection was, it would say, was an attractive point, appealing to those students. So yes, so I must say that the whole intersection or connection between, a regional university, Vietnam, ASEAN, the Philippines, and the idea of the West are all manifested in the case studies that I presented. Yeah. I don't know if it.
Yeah, so it's still, there are these ideas out there, the West, English, and it seems from your research that, these are flexible, that people play with them, but they're still also very powerful as well.
Yes, they are very powerful still. They are very powerful.
The fact that there's a regional university in Vietnam where there might be professors from the Philippines and students from Laos makes it sound like it's this, and it's in English, that it's this kind of, appropriate or sort of, that people are freely challenging the dominant norms of the world to do things their way. And in some ways they are, but in other ways they're confirming these sort of dominant structures at the same time.
So as I said, that is why the idea of the West remains to be so powerful, so powerful even in the context where you don't see any physical presence of anything from the West, but the idea or the name.
So one of the concepts you brought up in your talk was transformative mediocrity, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's something you say happens in this kind of complex context. Could you explain what transformative mediocrity is?
Okay, yes. So, as I said earlier, so much has been written about the internationalization of higher education. And of course, scholarly debate often criticize a lot of unethical practices and also certain ways of viewing international students or certain forms of pedagogies, seen in the sphere of international education. And so I said the rush to blame and shame is so normative, so common that sometimes, academics, probably including myself earlier, right?
Like when I was saying that they're just into it to make money, like that.
Right, or something like, it just wanted to see problems, identify problems, and sometimes you become so impatient to see what is going on actually with teaching and learning, right? So in my case, as I said, the case study was just a part of my longitudinal, research project, which I conducted for about 10 years in many different countries. And then I saw so much mediocrity that at some point I was so tempted just to say, okay, then let's talk about that. But at the same time, I also told myself, okay, let's take a step back and try to understand what, different individuals participating in the process actually experience learning and how learning could take place. And so yes, and then I understand, and then of course in the midst of so-called like a required proficiency in English from both teachers and students, and of course all those kind of issues would make you realize, right, so how could students learn, how could teachers teach, right? But and then my interviews and my side observation as well as very in-depth interaction with with a lot of participants show that learning could take place even when English wasn't considered at an ideal level, right? So for example, in that case study I presented, my participants highlighted how knowledgeable and how committed that professors in Vietnam have been to, community engagement, to global warming, issues in global warming, in environmental studies, and in poverty reduction. And then they realized that, look, you actually could learn and pay attention to those aspects rather than fixating on the problems with, insufficient English proficiency. And also a lot of participants push themselves to learn other languages in the process. And so yes, and you can see that yes, English is very important, but the role of other languages are also very important, and that is how I see learning taking place. And then individuals transform themselves in the process. And yes, so yes, I know that I'm very bold to to coin a term transformative mediocrity. What I mean is that even in a context where you see so much mediocrity or seemingly mediocre sort of context, transformations take place. Yes.
So there's so much more we could talk about this, but just in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to cut it short.
Okay.
But for people who are not familiar with your work, this is only one of many projects that you're engaged in, right? Perhaps you could give us a sense of some of the other things that you're looking at these days.
Yes. So right now I'm looking at African students studying in different Asian countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and China, right? And I'm also looking at the internationalization of higher education beyond English, meaning that I'm looking at French medium, Arabic medium, and Chinese medium, curriculum in the sphere of internationalization. Yes, and I have actually been publishing on those topics. And one notable one is my recent work with Routledge entitled.
You've written so many, I think it's hard to keep track of the titles.
I mean,
I can look it up on Amazon. Okay.
So it's called Transnational Crossing Asia and the West, Adjusted Desire, Transformative Mediocrity and Neo-Colonial Disguise, in which I really showcase my decade of data collection in different contexts. Yeah.
Like I said, we could probably keep going for another decade on this, but our camera will probably not last that long, so we'll have to stop it here. And we should talk more sometimes. This is really interesting.
Okay.
Thanks for stopping by. This is Senior Professor Phan Lê Hà from SHBIE, the Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah Institute of Education at Universiti Brunei Darussalam, who she just gave a talk to the IAS Wednesday seminar series. And hopefully you'll come back and give more talks as well. So
sure.
Thanks for sitting down and talking with us.
Thank you. Yes.